Good evening. I'm delighted to be joining with you here via the internet, and I wish to say to all of you an early Ramadan Kareem. And I want to talk tonight about AIC in terms of its founder, because I knew his founder very well. He was the first professor of Islamic studies in the religion department at Temple University. And as it turned out, I was his first PhD. That is, I finished my PhD under him, and I was the first one to get a PhD with Ismail Al-Faruqi. So let me talk a bit about Ismail, and then the work who he was and the work that he did at Temple, and then let me move to Ismail and the American Islamic College. Ismail Al-Faruqi was a Palestinian refugee, an Arab nationalist, and a scholar of Islam who would, during my years at Temple, be transformed into an Islamic scholar activist. And you'll see what I mean by that in some of my comments. Educated in the Arab world and the West, he had studied at missionary schools, a Catholic secondary school, and at the American University of Beirut, which was formerly the Syrian Protestant College. And finally at Harvard for an MA, and then earned his PhD at the University of Indiana. But after that, he then went and studied postdoctoral positions at Al-Azhar University for a number of years. Then the Islamic Research Institute in Karachi, where he was both a researcher, but also learning on spot. And then the University of Chicago, and then the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill University. Ismail was fluent in English, French, German, and obviously his native Arabic, and also very familiar with the Bible and particularly with Christianity. Ismail returned to the US from Canada and taught at Syracuse University for 3 years, then accepted a position at Temple University. Now, I should point out to you that at this point in history, this was a remarkable situation, because Ismail came to Temple and really began to do his work in a new religion department. It was a world religions department. So people in the department were, the teachers either needed to be born into a tradition and be scholars, though not necessarily requiring that they be practicing or the particular kind of practice, or they could be converts into the tradition. And Islam was really the last major world religion that was now being instituted within the religion department. And in the late 60s and early 70s, Islam was invisible in America. Sure, there were Muslims in America, but there weren't that many, and they were usually known as, Egyptians, Lebanese, etc. But Islam and Muslims, or the visibility of mosques. I was born in cosmopolitan Brooklyn, New York City, and I never remember anything being said in my early education about Islam and Muslims in any real kind of fashion, and certainly no awareness of mosques, etc. Let me tell you a little bit about my encounter with Ismail and Islam. Ismail and Lamia Al-Faruqi played a special role in my life. He once said to my parents in New York City at an American Academy of Religion meeting, and it was the only time that he actually ever met my parents. He said to my dad, "You are his physical parents, but I am his intellectual parent." If it had not been for Ismail, I would not have studied Islam nor benefited from the unique experience and insights of Temple University's program, because I was certainly not interested in or predisposed to want to study Islam. The big question was, why study Islam? And that was my response, my initial response, more than 40 years ago. It's actually 50 years ago, but I don't like to give away my age. So let's just say it was more than 40 years ago, when Bernard Phillips, the chair of the religion department at Temple, first suggested, when I went to him to talk about my program in general and what I wanted to do, which was to finish and get a PhD in Catholic theology, and then Temple required that you study 2 other religions, and I was going to look at Hinduism and Zen Buddhism, he suggested I take a course on Islam. This was the late 1960s. Now, I had spent 10 years in my earlier life with the Capuchin Franciscan fathers. I was never ordained, but I was educated, my college and even into my theology in Capuchin Franciscan monasteries. At the time, I was a young assistant professor of theology teaching at Rosemont College in Pennsylvania and had gone to Temple University to pursue a doctorate, attracted by the fact that I could actually major in Roman Catholic thought, but at a secular rather than a Catholic university. This was a first in terms of opportunity. The requirement, though, for all grad students in the department was to major in one religion and minor in two others. And Islam was not one of the ones that was on my list. So I'd gone to Phillips, the chair, and to my astonishment, he suggested I study Islam as one of my minor religions. Because Ismail had just finished a book on Christian ethics, Phillips thought we would work well together, across traditions. I did not. I knew little about Arabs or Islam, and what I did know, much of it through the media, etc., and a movie that I thought at the time was historical, and it proved that it wasn't. It was a best-selling book. It didn't attract me. However, Phillips was gently adamant. He's a very gentle man, but he was about as adamant as I ever saw Phillips get. And I, reflecting on the precarious position of a grad student who was also married and needed to finish his degree, said I would just take one course. Ismail's scholarship covered the whole spectrum of Islamic studies, covering areas such as the study of religion, Islamic thought, approaches to knowledge, history, culture, education, interfaith dialogue. He was one of the first major people involved in interfaith dialogue in the United States. Aesthetics, ethics, politics, economics, science, women's issues. And in fact, he was the one that suggested to me for my dissertation that I write on women and family law, which I did not really want to get into. I didn't really fully appreciate how relevant it would and could be. He had an encyclopedic knowledge, a rare person among contemporary Muslim scholars at the time, because his encyclopedic knowledge also meant that he could speak very forcefully about Christianity and Judaism. In fact, I remember at one point, we were in a period at that time when there was also talk about the God is dead theology within Christian theologians. And Ismail, with one or two of the people in the department, actually did what Martin Luther did when he nailed his points or theses on the door of a cathedral in which he was differing with, and he was a Roman Catholic priest, with his tradition. And Ismail did the similar thing, saying that he would challenge them and he would be defending some of what he thought were important Roman Catholic beliefs that actually some of them mirrored in Islam against the kind of positions that they were taking. Faruqi was a dynamic and charismatic lecturer, and that's the most important thing, because that's what ultimately got me to decide to study Islam. He made Islam and Muslim history come alive in a classroom. His knowledge of Western history, philosophy, and religion enabled him to place his remarks in a global context. My educational experience was deepened and broadened, to my surprise, by the fact that most of my classmates, and there were lots of them, normally you would not see lots of students in those days studying Islam. And I should point out that I'm pretty sure the Temple had the first department of religion that gave a doctorate in Islamic studies. Most other people in the field got their doctorates out of history departments, for example, or prominent schools of divinity. But here at Temple, Ismail had gone to in the Muslim world, recruited money every year to bring students from literally Egypt over to Malaysia, to bring them over regularly and be able to support them in study, but to have them also study courses in Christianity and Judaism. And some of this you will see when I talk about the vision that he had for AIC, which was very multi-religious in approach. Faruqi was a major catalyst and mentor. During my years as his student, Faruqi himself experienced a major transformation. As Faruqi would come to say, quote, "Until a few months ago, I was a Palestinian, an Arab, and a Muslim. Now I am a Muslim who happens to be an Arab from Palestine." Ismail was the most dynamic and engaging of lecturers. Like all great teachers, his energy and passion for his subject was contagious. In fact, during Ramadan, normally you would expect that the class would be shorter, etc. No, it wasn't. And it was the full time. He did not give us a break. His wife, when in fact it was time to break the fast, his wife would be in class, would go around and pass out dates to a number of us. But Ismail just kept moving. From the day he arrived until his untimely death, he and his wife, Lois Al-Faruqi, were murdered in their home in 1986. He would travel many times during the year, speaking and consulting in the Muslim world and raising funds to recruit and support the students. It was not uncommon, and this is important, for him to disappear after his last class that week and hop over to Libya, Egypt, Pakistan, Jordan, or Malaysia to raise funding for scholarships and return in time for his next class. I kind of remembered this just recently because when I first went to teach at Georgetown, I saw the president one day. In fact, the president invited me to address the board, and he went out of his way to say that here I was new at Georgetown, and he had been impressed by the fact that one or two students told him that they had this professor that they not only liked, but that had gone over to the Sudan and was sending faxes back to them and would be back in class in time. And I think I sort of got that by osmosis from Ismail. My Muslim classmates were bright, earnest young believers, as well as aspiring scholars studying Christianity and Judaism. Their enthusiasm would sometimes lead to awkward situations. A classmate studying Christianity visited an American classmate's family, and in his enthusiasm to make a point about his study of Christianity, he asked them for their Bible. Of course, they had a Bible, but there was like a concern among the family members because they weren't quite sure where it was in their apartment. Was it in the bedroom or was it here? Was it in this chest or not in that chest? And that's not true for many Christians, but it also is true even back then for some. They could be devout, but for certainly for Catholics, there was a tendency not really to be emphasize the entire Bible in the way that, for example, some Protestant groups do. We certainly did not emphasize the Old Testament other than in understanding Christ and the development of Christianity. But Ismail wore another hat as well. Some academics do and many don't. He was both an intellectual, a scholar, an author, but he was an institution builder. His desire to make Islam visible in American education and society was reflected in the late 1970s when he worked to have Islam as one of the major religions in the American Academy of Religions. You know, you need to think about this in those days. The American Academy of Religion, which is the organization in the world that deals with religion, etc., in those days, it had no section on Islam, let alone no permanent place and with multiple sections on Islam. It had lots with Christianity, Protestantism, Catholicism, Judaism, but not with regard to Islam. And in the 1980s, he and several colleagues also did something else that was creative and institutional. They created IIIT, the International Institute for the Study of Islam in Herndon, Virginia, in 1981. And in 1983, you had the launching of his unique vision, and that was the creation of the American Islamic College. I can still remember the early days when he would commute between Philadelphia and Chicago. I just marveled at the fact when I heard that he, was starting this college, and he was a senior officer in it. Ismail, as many of you know, was AIC's founding president and provost. His vision was extraordinary. And this is what's important. His vision was extraordinary in those days, and it remains extraordinary if one understands Ismail and his vision. It remains important today. That vision was to build a unique institution, a college fully accredited that would become a university in time, that served people of all faiths. It would be a Muslim, if you will, college or university, but one that served people of all faiths in a religiously and racially diverse, pluralistic American society. AIC was to be ecumenical or non-denominational, where Muslims and non-Muslims could study together and receive a rigorous education within a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multicultural Islamic liberal arts school. It would still instill in its students the ideals which, in his words, were the founding fathers of America, those ideals that the founding fathers of America pursued and which continue to be marks of this country's greatness. That was Ismail's words. And that could also be true today, even more today, when we see what the last 8 or 10 years have certainly given us in terms of the divisions in our society, religiously, ethnically, the rise of white nationalism and white supremacism, etc. AIC has now existed for 4 decades, educating a diversity of students. Like many institutions, it has had its ups and downs, especially many small institutions. One need only note, and some of you may not be aware of it, that as a result of COVID, there are actually a number of prominent small colleges that have existed and have provided first-rate educations that have announced they're shutting down because of lack of funding. Now, for example, in recent years, I knew that AIC had gone through a process of transition complicated by funding problems. However, I had not been aware of its new leadership under the current president, Professor Timothy Giannotti. Important, both because he's a Muslim and Italian American to me. Not only a noted scholar in Islamic studies, but also a dynamic leader. And that's what you need in the president of a university. He has to be somebody who's not only a scholar, but a person with vision, but a person with vision that is, if you will, an activist, is an institution builder. And that's what Ismail was. If you met him, if you saw him in action, speaking, moving around, etc., he was, a force of nature, as it were. My knowledge of AIC all changed when President Giannotti contacted me, and we had several long conversations about his vision and commitment to reinvigorate Ismail Al-Faruqi's vision and rebuild this special college and eventually university. When I looked at vision and plans and took a close look at its faculty, its core faculty and curriculum, I was very impressed. I can tell you for myself that AIC's core faculty, like its president, are all established scholars trained at major research universities and well-published scholars with visibility and strong professional reputations. In fact, after one of the conversations that I had with the president, I happened to be on the internet and somebody referred to the writings of referred to the writings of one of the professors, one of the core faculty members. As I look at our university and world today, Ismail Al-Faruqi's vision and the educational agenda he set for AIC speak to our contemporary realities in an America and globally. White nationalism and supremacism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and racism, hate speech, discrimination, and violence have become all too familiar. For some Americans, some of these qualities we saw as in other countries and signs of the instability of other countries or the authoritarian nature of other countries or the narrow-mindedness or the narrow-mindedness or of their religious vision and their cultural vision. Well, we've seen that in America. We've seen it happen often with a president that said Islam hates us, implemented a Muslim ban, and with the attack on the Capitol. So it's very much this vision of Ismail, the kind of vision he had in the past is needed today as much, if not even more, than in those days. These attitudes, these negative attitudes, these dangerous attitudes, with their hate speech and their hate actions at times and their violence, threaten the religious belief and religious communities, both cultural communities and religious communities, and they threaten America's cultural and religious diversity and pluralism, civil liberties and human rights. We have seen this all too often in the US, as I said, in presidential elections. And it's not just the statements of President Trump. If you look at also when Obama ran, as well as when Trump ran, a fair number of the Republican candidates used equally problematic language. One of them saying that a person couldn't be a believing Muslim and be in his cabinet. Another saying that Muslims should be asked whether or not they follow Sharia, and if they do, they should be sent home. Very much this kind of us and them world. But we see it also in Europe, in the UK, in the Netherlands, today in France and Austria, where under so-called, quote unquote, enlightened governments in France and Austria, you actually have particularly in the last couple of years, and very much in the last year, a move against Muslim civil society. Basically moving against the Muslim civil society, not just moving against extremists in the society, but in fact, closing down major mosques, closing down organizations, some of them that monitor Islamophobia within the country. And we see it also, obviously, today when we look at the genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar, the Uyghurs in China, and the anti-Muslim policies and anti-Christian policies in India. I must also, to also be very frank, there are a number of Muslim countries in which there are issues with regard to the status of non-Muslims and very specifically Christians. Pakistan, a country that I've known for years and been close to, has had problems throughout its history and certainly in recent years. Ismail Al-Faruqi, an indefatigable scholar activist, did not shy away from challenges, setbacks, and seemingly intractable problems and situations, whether it be Palestine, the US, or globally. He was indeed, in the best and truest sense of the word, his temperament was that of a mujahid. And I remember when he first taught me, I was very impressed when he emphasized in class, and I could see it when we would talk. He would say, in Islam, intentions are not enough. Good intentions have to be acted upon. That's what God expects of one. And I can remember having conversations with him about Palestine, but also a lot of other issues. Back in those days, the fact that Islam was relatively invisible in American academia, et cetera. But Ismail's approach was to just make it happen. So he could go to a group like the American Academy of Religion and be very vocal about not just wanting to have a panel that year, but wanting to see a permanent presence. And that meant that we had to have several years where we had meetings and were able to demonstrate that the study of Islam in terms of numbers of people that might, academics that might come and others that might come to sessions was viable. It was under his guidance that Islam took that role. And I was very happy a few years ago to become the president of the American Academy of Religion. He would not accept defeat, but advocate and espouse the renewal of this vision for AIC. If he were here today, if he was speaking to you, you would hear him repeat that vision and apply it today. And you would hear him basically emphasize the fact that that is what needs to be done. It needs to be done if one is a good Muslim. It needs to be done if one is a good citizen and cares about the country and society in which one lives in. And this is the kind of renewal and expansion that I have heard and that I believe will be seen and is being advocated by President Giannotti and the faculty. I'll end by saying that I hope that one will move forward and will be supportive of this project. And although it is not part of the preparation that I have, let me give you an example that I used to use to motivate people in my early years when I got my degree in Islam. there was no interest in Islam. It was only with the Iranian Revolution, but also when I then had to teach, and particularly when I had to do fundraising, because I used to be invited, and I still am, by Muslim organizations to be a fundraiser. And I would go with a variety, either by myself or a variety of Muslim scholars to do the fundraising. But one of the things I developed years ago and became unpopular with some people in an audience was to say to an audience, don't be a Muslim couch potato. Couch potato in the old days was for people who would dress up, for example, on Sunday in football, or exercise outfits and watch a football game. So they just watched, they didn't do. And I would say, well, the advantage of being a Muslim couch potato at fundraisers is that you're sitting all the time and you can't reach and get that wallet out of your back pocket. This is something that requires, it seems to me, a real sense of the world in which we live and a commitment to it. And it may be that some people will say, why, can we be sure of what the future is? The fact is, this is something that when we take a look at the vision that Ismail had, the unfolding of history, and where we are today, this is something that, it seems to me, Muslims and all believers and non-believers, good citizens, etc., should be committed to. The kind of education that Ismail envisioned for AIC and the kind of education that President Timothy Gennady and his core faculty represent and intend to implement. Thank you very much.